You know, in some ways, Ubisoft shutting down The Crew is a bit of a blessing in disguise because it did kickstart a conversation about the preservation of games. It is a discussion that's better had now than later when digital, really fully takes over or takes over enough where it becomes the kind of leading way to purchase products. When it comes to digital media, there's just no guarantee that it is something you'll be able to partake in forever, something you'll be able to gain access to forever. Digital media is under the control of the companies. You're beholden to the companies maintaining the services and licenses and whatnot. And so Ubisoft shutting down The Crew, they probably didn't expect the kinds of movements that would kickstart, like Stop Killing Games, which is essentially petitioning government entities to take action and enact laws that don't allow companies to just fully shut down a product and completely make it disappear from the face of the planet and steal it from people's libraries, which is what Ubisoft did when they shut down The Crew and announced this back in April of 2024. And a lot of headlines just weren't happy with this. It's straight up, what Engadget says here is what happened. It was a reminder that we own nothing as far as digital media is concerned. And this is an old game, and Ubisoft probably thought they could get away with this with few consequences, but it made a ripple effect, kickstarting the Stop Killing Games movement. And now we're getting a situation where Ubisoft is getting sued for shutting down The Crew. This is two individual gamers who bought the game a few years ago, and they just felt duped that this game was essentially shut down and removed from their libraries. Well, they actually bought the physical version of the game, but even those versions are completely not functional because the game files aren't in the physical edition. They got essentially keys for The Crew instead of getting files that could be installed from the disk and the like, or accessed from the disk. And so this is the result. Ubisoft is getting sued, and the hope from the folks who are suing Ubisoft is that this becomes class action, which means a bunch of folks who have experienced something similar can join in the lawsuit and make this a more intense legal battle for Ubisoft. So this right here is news from November 11th, 2024 via news outlet Polygon. And it reads right here, Ubisoft released The Crew in December of 2014, so a decade ago, but shut its servers after a decade due to server infrastructure and licensing constraints. Factors that are outside of the customer's control and stuff that shouldn't impact whether a product that you paid money for should remain in your library or not. Just as, if you were to buy a VHS or DVD or Blu-ray of a movie that, had licensing issues and essentially expired on the digital side of things. When it comes to physical media, what's great about them is that you can still keep those products and you can still access them whenever you feel like it, which is why the preservation of physical medium as a way to purchase products is still so important for media consumption. The game became totally unplayable due to its lack of a single-player offline mode. And The Crew isn't the kind of game that can't function as a single player. Frankly, a lot of people were confused that The Crew was online only and that there wasn't some form of an offline mode from the outset, but they never added that or implemented that throughout the lifespan of the game. So when the game shut down, it went offline completely, even though, just with the way the game is designed, it is viable as something you can play on your own. And the only refunds that were provided for The Crew were for those who purchased the game recently, but given the game is a decade old, obviously a lot of people could not participate in the offer. They could not get a refund because they bought the game years back. And so this is what lawyers representing the lawsuit wrote. This is a lawsuit filed on November 4th in California, and among the quotes that Polygon reported include, imagine you buy a pinball machine and years later you enter your den to go play it only to discover that all the paddles are missing, the pinball and bumpers are gone, and the monitor that proudly displayed your unassailable high score is removed. Turns out the pinball manufacturer decided to come into your home, gut the insides of the pinball machine, and remove your ability to play the game that you bought and thought you owned. That is essentially what this is. Just because they didn't physically enter your home to steal a product or a piece of media from you doesn't mean that it's not essentially theft. They can just do it digitally now. Digital theft is a thing, and when something gets removed from your library without consent, when it comes to a product that you purchase and you have no leeway for getting a refund, that is just basically the equivalent of a ghost coming into your house and doing some doohickey with your console and deciding that a game you purchased just no longer has any right to exist, and that you as a customer have no say on the handling of that digital product that you spent money on. Just because they didn't physically enter your home doesn't mean that this is any less invasive. The fact that products you purchase digitally are so lacking in security and any semblance of assurance that you'll be able to have long-term access to them no matter how many years go by is just very disconcerting indeed, especially because we are heading towards an all-digital future, or mostly digital future. Now, a pinball machine is obviously more expensive, but the core principle of somebody basically broke into my house and dismantled the product that I bought and got away with it is still there, regardless of whether we're talking about a pinball machine that's hundreds of dollars or a video game that you might have purchased for $60 and whatnot. The lawsuit continues by insisting that this is the equivalent of what happened with the Crew, as consumers were left unable to access something they purchased and assumed they owned. And so the lawsuit claims that players were duped in two ways. One, players were misled into thinking they were buying a game when they were merely licensing it. And this is something that government entities are beginning to agree on, as can be highlighted by the fact that California recently passed a new law that forces digital storefronts to admit that people who buy games are licensing that content, not buying it. They have to disclose that pretty clearly before a purchase is made. And so that's why if you go to Steam right now and purchase content through that storefront, it now tells gamers up front that they're not owning a game, they're just licensing it. And you can see that right here. A purchase of a digital product grants a license for the product on Steam. Now, it doesn't flat out say you don't own a game. It's not a very clear warning. It uses the minimum legal requirement as far as language is concerned to inform players that they're licensing a product, but it doesn't really convey the implications of that, you might not be able to play this years down the line if something goes wrong on the company who published this game side of things. It doesn't provide any of those warnings. You have to click on a link to go through the full terms and conditions and the Steam subscriber agreement. And so this is not enough of a warning of what the implications of this is, but I guess it's a step in the right direction. The only storefronts that are exempt from this law are the ones where once you download a product, you can actually interact with it without any sort of DRM, without any sort of online restrictions, which is why GOG is allowed to make fun of Steam and fire some shots, stating things like, if only there was a storefront that actually lets you own your games. They're even going around pitching a similar warning as Steam provides now, except theirs is a lot more consumer friendly because this is how GOG actually functions. So right here we have a screenshot, them pitching the message: a purchase of a digital product on GOG grants you its offline installers, which cannot be taken away from you. It is basically the advantages of physical purchases, but in digital form, where as long as you have that installer, you can replicate it how you want, you can distribute it however you want, no matter what happens to the publishers or, what happens to the services that support these products or, what licensing issues there might be. So long as you have that installer, you can install the game, play it, access it whenever you want, as long as that installer is protected. So yeah, the argument that players were misled into thinking they were buying a game and they were merely licensing it, I think that is a strong case, especially given the legal precedent that California set by passing that law where you have to disclose that when you buy a game digitally, you're licensing it, and that disclosure just hasn't been there until laws forced such disclosures. And then the second way that this lawsuit feels players are duped is that Ubisoft falsely represented the Crew's files were on its physical discs to access freely, and that the discs weren't simply a key for the game. And there's insistence that Ubisoft is essentially violating California consumer protection laws. And that's the thing about physical media and video games. Even that is no guarantee that you'll have access to a game. Ubisoft in particular has been notorious for doing things like, even if you buy the physical version of the game, you have to download a patch when you install the game from the disc from online in order to be able to start the game at all. So if there comes a point where Ubisoft servers go down and their services end, and you want to play your physical copy of that Ubisoft game, because you won't have access to the servers that download the patch that allow you to play the game, the physical disc is still going to be worthless. It might have most of the files, but there's this one key file you have to download from online for it to function, with your inability to access that file that's only available online and through download. the physical disc might as well just be paperweight. And yeah, the reason this lawsuit is being put out there is because the lack of disclosures and the lack of clarification on what exactly purchasing the crew, whether physically or digitally, means, and the fact that no clarifications or disclosures were made on whether this is something that can happen in terms of the game going away and disappearing and being removed from your library, essentially. And with both of these plaintiffs having purchased the games in 2018 and 2020 respectively, with years having gone by and with no options of a refund, the lawsuit essentially alleges that neither of these two customers would have purchased the game at the price point that they were available for, or would have made different purchase decisions if they were informed of the possibility of the game service shutting down and rendering the crew completely unplayable even in an offline mode. That was just not what people signed up for when they made the purchase decision to spend money on the crew, believing that, regardless of whether this is a game that takes off or not, or a game that they will access frequently or not, on some level, they want the assurance that if for whatever reason they want to revisit this game, they are able to on some level. And so what the plaintiffs are looking for is essentially for Ubisoft to offer monetary relief and damages, and they're hoping that this lawsuit becomes class action, meaning other crew players may get involved. Honestly, I think all of that is performative. Whatever monetary relief and damages they would get wouldn't be a whole lot. I think what they're mainly trying to do is set a legal precedent for situations like these, so that moving forward, companies will be more incentivized to include offline modes for their games. It takes one legal victory on this front for future cases like these to have a greater chance of leading towards the consumer side of things when they make the same argument in the future. So I think ultimately this is a long-term battle. This feels like it's about setting the foundation for essentially legal change to standardize and normalize this idea that companies shouldn't be able to get away with stuff like this, and that they should be punished for putting customers in a situation where they spend money on something that's not guaranteed to carry on until the customers feel like it. I think if this case succeeds, it has the potential to snowball into a greater kind of change across the board, into holding the games industry accountable for their lack of consideration for game preservation and their lack of consideration for just consumer protection when it comes to purchases that they make, and just the utter disregard for this very simple idea that when you buy something, you should be able to keep it, and that control shouldn't be up to the companies. It should be up to the customers what they do with that product. I think it all kind of aligns with what's happening with Stop Killing Games, which is making all of the same arguments. I think it aligns with the recent laws that were passed that essentially force companies to disclose the fact that people are not buying digital content, they're just licensing that, and that at any point that content can be revoked and taken from you and stolen from you. So it feels like we're setting up little building blocks for the long-term protection as far as digital content is concerned, which, again, better now than later as the world heads into a more and more digital future. There were some setbacks when, for example, the Video Game History Foundation did a research on how 87% of classic video games are completely missing. And so they tried to propose to the government, to the United States Copyright Office, that old video games be allowed to be preserved as libraries preserve books and museums preserve art, by allowing institutions to have emulated games that preserve classic games that are just no longer available in any way, shape, or form within reason. But the U.S. Copyright Office decided to struck down that effort and instead listen to the pleas of corporations, saying that such a library would allow people to essentially abuse that method to play these games for recreational purposes instead of for educational purposes, which is what the proposal by the Video Game History Foundation is aiming for, where it's about preservation and, allowing people to access these classic games that are not reasonably available in the marketplace for private study, scholarship, teaching, or research. The argument that companies make is that, well, people would just use that to play these games recreationally. But then the counter argument is that, you don't just go to museums to study. You also go there recreational. You go to libraries and rent out books, not just to, bask in some of the history of books that have been written, but also because you might enjoy reading those books. Like, recreational is an aspect of preservation and being able to access previous works that have been preserved. That's just, part of the whole package of preservation. And so that shouldn't even be a concern, especially when companies are still allowed to take those classic games and re-release them and still monetize them while allowing the very classic versions of those games to exist in preserved format. Even if people are approaching renting these games out or emulating these games for scholastic purposes, they're going to probably have fun along the way, because games are meant to be fun. And so this risk that preserved video games will be used for recreational purposes, that's not a risk. That's part of the point. Because when you study video games, you're also, by extension, studying fun. You're studying an activity that is basically recreational by nature. And so the argument is just really silly. And so this was a major step back that the U.S. Copyright Office is so antiquated in its way of thinking, or is so prone to being lobbied by video game companies and publishers and organizations like the ESA. But alas, that doesn't mean that we aren't seeing efforts left and right, and that this issue isn't becoming more and more of a greater topic that's being pushed to the forefront, especially as people think long-term about a future where, if efforts like these aren't pursued now, then we'll be far worse off when all of the media we purchase is fully corporate controlled, instead of us having agency over the media that we purchase. So at the end of the day, it makes me happy to see all of the proactive steps that are being taken on multiple fronts, be it the Stop Killing Games movement, which has garnered so much support, and I mean like hundreds of thousands of signatures for its petition, to individual gamers and concerned customers who are coming out here and engaging in legal battle against corporate giants like Ubisoft and trying to, garner as much support and hoping that this can go class action so that this crew, no pun intended, can get bigger and take on Ubisoft on a greater scale. All of this is ultimately really positive and highlights that there are informed people out there about this, and that they are taking action to pave the road for a better standardization and normalization of laws that protect customers who purchase media and digital products in a way that just seems reasonable. You buy something, you should get to keep it. Like that. That's not rocket science. That's not some controversial take. That's just how customers expect purchases to work. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is everything you need to know about the latest in regards to games preservation and the saga surrounding Ubisoft shutting down the crew. This new lawsuit that follows the Stop Killing Games movement, and the additional pressure that the games industry is seeing to take games preservation and customer protection as far as digital content purchases are concerned seriously. Share your thoughts and opinions about all this in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.